if you do a web search, a Google search on research methodology, in a large number of cases, especially if you are looking at research on humans, you're going to find a distinction between quantitative and qualitative research. What does this mean? Well, one way of thinking about this distinction is to recognize that you have mathematical inquiry, scientific inquiry, and humanistic inquiry. And by humanistic inquiry, I mean things like philosophical inquiry, and aesthetic inquiry. By mathematical inquiry, I mean inquiry based on axioms and definitions. And by scientific inquiry, I mean inquiry based on data or information. And the data that you have could be quantitative or qualitative. So in other words, the distinction between quantitative research and qualitative research is a matter of the kind of data that you use. If you use quantitative data, it's quantitative research, and if you use qualitative data, it is qualitative research. But then, what does this mean? What do you mean by quantitative data? Or what do you mean by qualitative data? One way of making this distinction is to say that quantitative data is data coded in terms of numerals. And this kind of data is coded in terms of words. So if I say that my height is 5 feet 6 inches, 5 and 6 are numerals, so that is quantitative data. But if I say I'm medium height, medium is a category expressed by a word, that is qualitative. That could be one possible way of making this distinction, coded in terms of numerals or words. And this is quite often the idea that people have. So for instance, if you give student grades A, B, C, D, and F, these are letter grades. You could say that A means extremely good, B means very good, D means poor, and this means fail. Somehow these are expressed in terms of words, so people will say this is qualitative. But exactly the same grades, if you say F is 0, D is 1, C is 2, B is 3, and A is 4, these are coded in terms of numerals, so you say, oh, that is quantitative data. There is no difference between them except that you can do arithmetic operations here. That doesn't seem to be very revealing. Why is it not revealing? Because I have heard statements in research methodology courses to the effect that one's zip code is typically expressed in terms of numbers. So for example, 411008 is a zip code. This is quantitative, but if you are talking about the name of a city such as Pune, that is qualitative. This, in fact, is something that I have heard in a research methodology course that's available on a CD, DVD. Now, if this is quantitative, you would expect something like, what is the average zip code of Pune? That question makes no sense. Like you add up all the zip codes and find the mean. What is the average telephone number in India? Add up all the telephone numbers and find the mean. That's completely meaningless. So the fact that you're using numerals is irrelevant for research. This is simply some kind of tag. There is nothing else. 4 doesn't have any meaning of the number 4 here, or this doesn't express a number. So what we need to do is to distinguish between numerals on the one hand, these tags, and the information carried by the numerals, namely numbers. So let us say coded in numbers versus coded in words. And if you say numbers, then you will immediately see that so-called telephone number is not really a number. It doesn't mean 41,000 something something. You don't add up these numbers, divide them, find the mean, and so on. They're simply some kind of tags. Numerals are used for tagging devices. But on the other hand, if you say my height is 5 feet 6 inches, this is greater than 5 feet 5 inches, and it is less than 5 feet 7 inches. So these are actually numbers. The zip code is not a number. That makes some sense. Now, you can code two kinds of things in numbers. You can code countable quantity and uncountable quantity. So for example, if I say that I have 10 fingers on my hands, then I can count them. If I count the number of chairs in this room, that is countable. But if I'm talking about my weight is not countable. My height is not countable. Time is not countable. But these are all numerically codable quantities. So by quantity, we mean things that you can get by counting or things that you can get by measuring. So for quantitative data, we use these two techniques, counting or measuring, to arrive at some kind of number. And data that is expressed after counting and measuring, data expressed in terms of some kind of number, is quantitative data. Why do we use quantitative data? Because we can now use procedures or operations on numbers. You can add them up, you can subtract, you can divide, you can do stats. Then you can also apply calculus to calculate certain things. So essentially, what this means is that you can use numerical calculations. So data that you can use for numerical calculations would be quantitative data. But when you have data that is not amenable to numerical calculations, that will be qualitative data. So when you put a litmus paper in some alkali acid and you find that the color changes from blue to red or red to blue, that would be qualitative, because that is a matter of category. So data in terms of categories, where you don't have numbers, is qualitative data. Data in terms of that is expressed in terms of numbers is quantitative. That's essentially the distinction between quantitative and qualitative data. But Notice that we are now talking about two kinds of scientific data. So the term qualitative would also apply to this. For instance, if you are thinking of something like graph theory, graph theory can be done without numbers. Topology, a whole bunch of discrete math, set theory, function theory, and so on, are all done in terms of mathematical concepts, but without numbers. So what that means is that qualitative coding of data and qualitative theories can be mathematicized. So the distinction is not that of mathematical versus non-mathematical, but within mathematical, certain kinds of particular mathematical models that lend themselves to numbers. That's a very different meaning of qualitative than the one that is normally found in many textbooks in research methodology. When people use this word qualitative, they mean something other than what I have just described. So let me give a brief idea of what that means. This word is used in typically to refer to certain kinds of humanistic research that I would say are rather descriptive, interpretive of the particular. What does that mean? Let me give you some examples. When you do a case study, so for example, the symptoms of a patient and the kind of changes which have taken place over, let us say, 2 months, a doctor writes a report, that will be a case study. Case studies are done in medicine, they are done in management, they are also done, analog of case studies in anthropology is field work. So a researcher goes into a field and describes or interprets what is seen in a particular community with respect to a particular group of people, or 1 or 2 people quite often, and this is called ethnographic field work. Sometimes they call it ethno-methodology. If it is sociology, they call it interpretive work. This is a special category of research, and quite often what happens in this kind of research is in order to justify the claim that the researcher is making, you begin with the story. So if you're reading, for example, a journalistic article in a newspaper or in a magazine, quite often a journalist, in order to make a point, begins with a story, such as there is such and such person who grew up in such and such background, went to such and school, married so and so, and these such and such things happened, and so on. And after that story, in 1 or 2 paragraphs, you make certain general points. So this is story-based or anecdote-based justification. So the basic argument is such and such things are true about this anecdote, so we can generalize it to the whole community or the whole population. And this is what happens actually in a medical case study. So a doctor who is studying a patient, one particular patient, is really analogous to a particular story or an anecdote. And the doctor is making an interpretation of the patient's illness. This is also true about, let us say, you get medical test, a blood test, and you make a diagnosis which is an interpretation of the blood test results. So interpretation by itself is not restricted to humanistic research. We make these interpretations all the time. But such interpretations are legitimized by a general theory. that makes predictions. And predictions require generalizations. For instance, given Newton's theory, we can predict that there is a correlation between the length of a pendulum and its period. This is predictable, this is derivable from Newton's theory. That's a prediction. And this was found out by Galileo, who stated this as a law relating the period and the length. That also makes it prediction. Namely, if you know the length of a pendulum, you can predict its period. So there are two kinds of predictions. The theory makes a prediction of a correlation. The correlation itself can make a prediction of one value of a variable from the other value. This is characteristic of scientific inquiry. Scientific inquiry systematically makes predictions. But when you make a literary interpretation, interpreting a poem, you don't make any predictions. And quite often in this category of research, you don't make any predictions. They are analogous to literary interpretations. And what is more, in medical case studies, I should erase some of this. Medical case studies you don't generalize on the basis of one or two case studies. Case study would be something like a data point in medicine, a data point with a large number of properties, large number of variables. You can generalize it only if you accumulate a large number of case studies. And when you have many case studies, what happens in medicine is someone does a meta-analysis. In order to identify the generalizations. Generalizations in the population based on a sample of case studies, reasonably large sample of case studies. So this is crucial for case studies in science. This is also done in psychology, where you cannot do controlled experiments, you make use of meta-analysis. But when you have anthropological fieldwork, ethnography, the tradition of using meta-analysis is not yet present in the field. So there are problems in generalization. Quite often, when people say qualitative studies, qualitative research, what they mean is research based on individual case studies, individual anecdotes, stories, interpretations, but not generalizable because the meta-analysis is absent, as in the case of the interpretation of a poem. That is not the distinction that I made earlier. The distinction that I made earlier was in terms of numerical calculations versus non-numerical calculations. The distinction that we're making here is actually one of predictions, generalizations, and reasoning from sample to population. These are two different meanings of qualitative research and the distinction between qualitative and quantitative. Now you can read through the literature and look at qualitative and quantitative studies and figure out for yourself which of these categories a particular qualitative research belongs to, in terms of this, namely number versus non-number, or this legitimate generalizations in terms of sufficient sample or not. Thank you.